Right, I'm just going to share my screen, which hopefully will work. Is that okay? Everybody see that? Okay, great.
Yes, perfect.
So this afternoon, I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes so that we've got time for some questions at the end. And I'm going to be giving a pretty brief overview of theory and research in the area of why learning environments matter. And I'll be focusing in on a few specific aspects of the environment. Then I'm going to move on to talking about the impact of being outside in nature. I'm going to talk very briefly about differential susceptibility to the educational environment. So the idea that some students might be more affected than others by the environment that they learn in. And then towards the end, I'm going to move on to talking about my own research project. I'm going to talk about bridging the gap between research and practice in education, which is very much the focus of the project I'm doing now, but also the work I did previously. I was working for almost 5 years for the Chartered College of Teaching as a research and learning specialist. And my role there was very much about making research more accessible for teachers to access and making it kind of meaningful to their everyday practice. And then finally, I'll talk about my research project, which Rebecca already mentioned, which is about using wearable devices in schools to try and unpick exactly what's going on for children when they're learning in indoor and outdoor learning environments. And then, as I said, some time for questions at the end. So I just wanted to start off by asking you very briefly to think of a learning environment that you experienced as a child when you were at school. Doesn't matter what stage of your education that was, and just take a moment to visualize yourself in that space. Think about what you'd see if you looked around, what you might hear, and what you would feel. And I would imagine that whatever you are thinking of right now, regardless of where in the world you're educated or how long ago you were in school, you're probably imagining an environment that looks something like one of these pictures, because classrooms have changed remarkably little really in the last 100 years or so, despite the fact that the world has changed massively and what children will experience in their adult life is hugely different to what they would have experienced as adults 50 or 100 years ago. But classrooms pretty much always have tables and chairs, things on the walls, a focal point at the front. So classrooms are often still quite teacher-centered, with a teacher at the front, some kind of blackboard, whiteboard, interactive whiteboard, whatever it is, and 4 walls around them and a ceiling. This is very much how we tell ourselves that schools look and where learning should take place. So there's often not very much attention paid to the physical learning environment. We all have an idea of what classrooms are, and we pretty much just accept that as the norm. But research suggests that the learning environment really does matter, and many different aspects of the learning environment matter. These are just some of the things that I've read about over the last couple of years as part of my PhD, and I won't have time to touch on all of these, but there's plenty of research that looks at the impact of all of these different variables. I'm just going to touch today quite briefly on noise, visual clutter, and window views, just as a starting point. So first of all, thinking about noise, there's a lot of research on noise, and it's pretty conclusive that noise does affect learning. So when I say noise, I'm talking about background noise in the classroom, like background chatter, chairs scraping, things like that, and also external noise like road traffic, aeroplane, air traffic, and so on. And it particularly affects reading. So quite an interesting study looked at how noise levels relate to SAT scores in a study of 50 London primary schools. And they found a significant correlation there, so that noisier schools tended to have worse SATs results. Now, of course, there are a lot of other variables that could be affecting that. It could be that noisier schools might have more challenging children to begin with, or children living in more difficult circumstances. Maybe it's more difficult to attract good quality teachers in noisier schools because of their location or so on. There's obviously lots of different things that could affect it. But whilst controlling for variables like SES, there was still a significant correlation there. It's also not just about academic performance. So children at noisier schools have been found to have higher blood pressure and are also more likely to give up more quickly on a task than children who are at quieter schools. So you know, the idea behind that is that children have that kind of higher level of frustration because of the stress caused by the noise. So they might give up on things more quickly. Some of the most interesting research in that area to control for some of those variables that I mentioned earlier is research that looks at the same group of children in different circumstances, with different levels of noise. So there was this study in 2006 that looked at a new airport that was constructed, and they looked at children's levels of stress hormones before the airport was constructed, and during construction when there was a lot of noise, and afterwards when there was a lot of air traffic. And they found that children's levels of stress hormones almost doubled over the course of a year. And when they compared that with a control group to make sure it wasn't just that children's levels of stress hormones naturally increase as they become a year older, they found that there was a significant difference there too. Another study, which is quite old now, but a really interesting one, looked at the effects of train noise. So there was a school that had an elevated train track on just one side of the school building. And so this provided a really good opportunity to compare the reading performance of the children whose classrooms was on that side of the building with the noise from the train, compared to children who were studying in classrooms on the other side of the building without the noise. And they found that the children who were on the noisy side had much poorer reading performance than the children in the quieter classrooms. And then in a follow-up study, they actually put things in place to reduce that noise, so soundproofing in the classroom, and they put something on the track itself to reduce the noise. And then over time, that kind of discrepancy between the two classes' performance disappeared. And so that kind of study provides really quite compelling evidence of the impact. One of the things that's quite significant as well is we know that younger children are the worst affected by background noise, because although as adults, you might have heard of the cocktail party phenomenon if you have looked at those kind of attention studies. As adults, we're pretty good at being in a kind of party situation where there's lots of conversations going on around us, and we can just tune into the person that's talking to us and focus in on what they're saying. But that is not an ability that we're born with. It's something that develops over time and doesn't develop fully until about 12 or 13 years of age. So younger children find it much more difficult to distinguish speech from background noise. And particularly when children are first learning to speak and are kind of hearing lots of new vocabulary that might have a lot of background noise. And yet our early years classrooms tend to be very, very noisy places to be. Finally, interestingly, when children's cognitive performance has been affected by noise, exposure to natural soundscapes has been found to help restore that performance. So this study from 2019 looked at, I think it was river noises, played those to children, which helped to restore some of their attentional capacity in the task that followed. There are a few issues with research on noise. One of them, as I already mentioned, is the kind of association with socioeconomic status. So a lot of later studies found that in particular aircraft noise is really associated with SES, because children who tend to live and go to school in areas very near airports tend to be from lower SES families because properties are cheaper there. And once that was controlled for, some of the effects aren't as strong anymore. Also, not all studies report a correlation between noise and performance. It seems to depend on the type of noise and the type of task that's being done. So I mentioned background chatter before. Something like background chatter is much more distracting and disruptive when a child's reading, for example, because you're hearing language and you're trying to process language at the same time. Whereas something like background music, instrumental music without lyrics, would interfere much less with a reading task. But it's also not as simple as all noise is bad. So we know that noise acts as a stressor, it increases arousal, but that's not always necessarily a bad thing. So for well-rehearsed and simple tasks, it might actually improve performance to have kind of low levels of stress. And some of you might be familiar with the Yerkes-Dodson law and that kind of curve there, whereby kind of really low arousal and low stress actually isn't good for learning performance because you're just fatigued and feeling sleepy and unfocused. Really high stress and high arousal also isn't good for learning performance because you might feel anxious. but what's optimal is that intermediate level of arousal. And that's a point that I'll kind of revisit throughout this talk today in terms of learning environments. Moving on to another aspect of the learning environment, visual clutter. So by visual clutter, I mean the things that are in a child's field of vision when they're in the classroom. So this picture on the screen, where there are lots and lots of things stuck onto cupboards, on walls and so on, to really try and make the environment as bright and attractive and colourful to children as possible. And this is really common in pretty much all classrooms that I've been in over the last decade or so. Now, although that's trying to make the environment very appealing for children, it actually provides a lot of distraction as well. And most of us would assume that younger children are more distractible than older ones, and that their ability to maintain an attentive state improves with age. Yet the way we organise and decorate our classrooms kind of works against that idea, because often the classrooms for the youngest children have the most visual distractions, whereas classrooms as you move into secondary school and college and so on tend to be much kind of clearer, more streamlined spaces. There have been some interesting studies on this too. So this study by Fisher, they went into a lab and created a classroom environment that they could manipulate. So they created a very busy, highly decorated classroom in the lab with lots of things on the walls. And they taught 5-year-olds 3 science lessons in that environment. And then they taught the same 5-year-olds 3 science lessons in a streamlined, non-cluttered environment. And they found that the children performed much better in the classroom with the blank walls, without all of this distracting material, because they were basically on task more in the non-cluttered environment. So over 85% of the children spent more instructional time off task in the decorated classroom, and that led to lower learning outcomes when they were tested on what had been presented during that lesson. When they reduced that visual clutter, it reduced the children's off-task behaviour and their learning performance improved. There were, a couple of criticisms after this study of people saying, okay, but when you take children into a lab classroom, it's a new environment, they've never seen these things on the walls before, so they will be distracting. But in reality, if they're in a child's classroom, they get used to them over time and they're not a distraction anymore. They become like the wallpaper that we have in our homes. They don't really notice them anymore. They become habituated to them. And Godwin and colleagues did a follow-up study this year and looked at whether those visual distractions continue to be a source of off-task behaviour over time. And they found that they did, even after a 2-week follow-up, the children were still distracted by that visual cluster. They hadn't become completely habituated to it. Other lab studies have found similar results as well. So one where they showed children videotaped lessons. Half of them, the teacher was standing in front of a plain background. Half of the lessons, the teacher was standing in front of colourful classroom displays. And again, children spent more time focused at the teacher in the plain background condition, and they had higher learning scores as a result. And then similarly, this other study, children were doing cognitive tasks of attention and memory in a cubicle, either a cubicle with blank walls or with highly decorated walls, what they're calling a high load visual environment, and children performed better in that blank cubicle. Now that might sound a little bit depressing to think, well, I don't want to teach children in a blank cubicle or in a white box. that doesn't sound like a very inspiring place for children to be. And I agree that it's not. Interestingly, some kind of more detailed research that's looked at lots of different design parameters that might explain variation in pupils' performance has found, similarly to what I was saying about the kind of stress and arousal curve, there's also a curvy linear relationship between performance of students and the levels of colour and visual complexity in the learning environment. So children perform best in those intermediate classrooms, so that not the ones with the highest levels of colour and complexity or the lowest, but where there's that intermediate level of arousal. And interestingly, this study as well from Barrett and colleagues found that the impact of the classroom environment was far greater than that of the overall school environment. So they looked at lots of different schools, almost 60 schools, and they intentionally looked at all different styles and designs of schools, you know, modern buildings, older buildings, multi-story, single story, and so on. And they found that the overall school characteristics had very marginal impact on students' performance. It was much more about the classroom. And I guess that's because they were primary schools that they looked at. And, you know, in primary schools, those students spend almost every hour of the day in that one classroom. So that's the environment they're interacting with the most. But I thought that was also interesting in terms of teachers. It's good to know that no matter what kind of school you're in or what the rest of your school are doing, changes within just your own classroom can have quite a big impact on the students that you're teaching. And this study found that these things like light, temperature, air quality, and so on, all together explained 16% of the variation in pupils' academic progress. Just in case you're wondering, those couple of things that I mentioned there, ownership, what they meant by the ownership of the environment was how easily children could take ownership of their classroom, so how accessible resources were for children to get to themselves. Flexibility was about how easily the room could be rearranged for kind of different group dynamics and different activities. And complexity was about the visual complexity, so what was on displays, how many different kinds of shapes and colours and so on. Because obviously the more complex it is, the more cognitive load it takes for you to process that. These are just a couple of figures from that paper. So the top one just showing on the right hand side all the different aspects of the built environment that might be affecting pupils in the classroom and have a knock-on effect of their outcomes. And then underneath that table shows the proportion of increase in pupils' progress that was accounted for by each of the environmental factors. But I should just point out those proportions there on the right-hand column are a proportion of the 16% of variance. So when you look at that and you see kind of, oh, naturalness of the classroom accounts for 49%, which would be absolutely huge, but that's 49% of the 16% impact it had. So what do learning environments look like if they draw on all these things I've just mentioned? So if they have natural lighting, intermediate use of colour, intermediate visual complexity. What I think of when I think about those kind of environments are those kind of Montessori and Emilia Reggio style environments, because those approaches to education place huge importance on the significance of the learning environment. The Emilia Reggio approach called the environment the third teacher. And there's a real focus there on a carefully prepared environment, natural materials, and that accessibility and ownership, as well as having flexibility of the space for independence and socialization. And those kind of environments, if you're not familiar with them, look like this. So you'll see there tend to be fewer tables and chairs, more opportunity to kind of learn standing up, sitting on the floor, laying down, and so on. Lots of natural materials, loose parts, and things like that. And when I look at these environments, they remind me very much of being outdoors. To me, these environments are very much about bringing the outdoors in, the colour kind of palette that's used, the use of plants indoors, and so on. So something that I'm really interested in is whether there is a link between effective learning environments and feeling like you're outside in nature, because natural outdoor environments have an awful lot of things on those lists that kind of we just covered in the last few slides that we know research tells us have an impact on children. So natural lighting, that use of colour and visual stimulation, accessible resources. You know, if you're going to a forest school for your nursery environment, you don't have sticks and stones shut away in a box in a cupboard somewhere. Everything's accessible for you to pick up and touch and experience. They're often very flexible spaces, and often as well better air quality outdoors and lower levels of noise, because there's not that reverberation and echo off of all the surfaces that you get in an indoor classroom, which creates a lot of that background noise, which is so distracting. So thinking, you know, linked to that, thinking about nature and the impact of nature on children's learning, there have been some really interesting studies that show even window views of nature can have a really significant effect on students. So This one study looked at university students who had nature views from their dorms where they stayed, and when they were compared with peers who had built views, the ones with the nature views scored higher on measures of attention. There was a more experimental study where students were randomly allocated to classrooms with no windows, nature views or built views, and attentional capacity was 14% higher in the nature view condition. And similarly, window views in the workplace. There's lots of workplace studies on this, that they're associated with lower stress and better job satisfaction. And they've even been shown to affect rates of aggression and violence in inner city residents. So depending on whether, again, they have nature views from where they're living or built views. So I'm going to move on now to talk about the impact of being outside in nature, which is really the focus of my PhD work. And there's way too much research here for me to possibly cover it, even if you were giving me 10 hours. But exposure to nature, contact with nature, has been shown to relate to a huge range of positive outcomes for children that are listed here. So cognitive outcomes like attention and memory, behavioural outcomes like self-regulation and pro-social behaviour, and well-being outcomes as well, like stress, as well as lots of physical health outcomes like physical development, sleep, and so on. Most of this research has been correlational, particularly the bigger studies that are out there. So there are a lot of studies that follow along the same sort of lines as this top one, where children's area where they live at home or at school is quantified in terms of how green it is. So satellite imagery is usually used for that, to calculate the proportion of green space around their home or their school. And sometimes that's correlated with school exam results. But in this case, this study actually gave children cognitive tests every 3 months for a period of time. And they found that enhanced progress in all areas that they tested was associated with greenness in and around the school. And that was partially mediated by reduced air pollution. So that's, possibly, a strong mediator there. Interestingly, they found that greenness around the home didn't affect their performance in those tests, possibly because, children of that age, most of their waking time is actually spent in the school environment rather than at home. As I mentioned, there are others like this one below, where they look at standardized test results. Again, better performance associated with more vegetation around the school. Some of those studies actually have found it's particularly tree canopy that seems to have an effect more than other types of greenery, which is quite interesting. And I don't think anyone's quite unpicked why that is, but that's a finding that's been found across a few studies. And then this one at the bottom looked at rural children and their responses to stress. And they found that if children had more nearby nature, so this one actually did find that the home environment had an impact. If there was more nature near the home, children were less likely to report stressful events, or even if they had experienced stressful events, it had caused less psychological distress. So when they rated themselves on a stress scale, they felt less disturbed by the stressful events that had happened. So that suggests that nearby nature is acting somehow almost as a buffer against stressful life events. Also, there's some research that looks at MRI scans, and there's some evidence there that lifelong exposure to residential green space is associated with positive changes in the brain, so more grey and white matter in areas of the brain that are associated with working memory and attention. And another study that looked specifically at preschool children and found that preschools where the children spent more time outdoors, those children were less likely to show symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, and were more likely to score better, again, on attention tasks. So although most of the research is correlational, there are some more experimental studies as well. This one at the top was interesting because I think there's a common misconception that a lot of teachers think, oh, I don't want to take my children outside because when they come back in, they're going to be really hyper and off task, and it will take ages for them to settle back down again. And this study actually showed the opposite of that. So they looked at children's engagement following an outdoor lesson. So they had kind of half of the classes had been on an outdoor lesson, then they came back inside and they observed children's engagement in that indoor lesson. The other half had already had an indoor lesson, and then they went into a second indoor lesson and they looked at their engagement. And they measured the engagement in lots of different ways, including the number of teacher redirects there were. So they counted the number of times the teacher had to say things like, can you please get on with what you're supposed to be doing, or please stop chatting and get back to your task. And they found that there were almost half the number of redirects in the lessons that followed being outside. So suggesting that, you know, those students were better able to come back in and focus after that outdoor time. This is an interesting study to look up as well if you have the time. They put 6 large plants, or kind of small trees, in a high school student's classroom, and they found that attendance improved and incidents of misbehaviour decreased after those were put in the classroom. They compared that to a baseline phase and also to a control class as well. There's also lots and lots of experimental studies conducted with adults which look at the effect of being in forest settings and evidence reduced stress, so reduced cortisol and heart rate and blood pressure. But there's not really been many studies like that done with children. So lots and lots of evidence that nature is good for us, but why would it have that effect? You know, how could this be? There are 2 main theories that seek to explain the effect of nature. The first is attention restoration theory. So this basically assumes that there are 2 different types of attention. There's effortful directed attention, which is what you're doing now, where you're having to kind of focus in on what I'm saying and make an effort to listen to me. And then there's that effortless and voluntary attention, where we don't have to try and focus on something, it just naturally happens. And so the idea is that first type of attention, directed attention, is a limited resource and it can be depleted. So the more we focus and attend to something, the more that's depleted and the more difficult it's going to be to focus on something else straight afterwards. So this theory says that natural environments can restore attention after depletion because they engage the brain effortlessly. So we're naturally engaged with natural environments. They're not difficult to process. We can effortlessly pay attention to them because they capture our attention in a very automatic bottom-up way. So it's not like in an urban environment where you might have to cross a road and you have to very consciously look at what's going on. And there might be a car speeding by and that grabs your attention in quite a dramatic way, which drains your attentional resources. So the idea is that natural environments reduce our mental fatigue. Another theory is stress reduction theory, or it's sometimes called psychoevolutionary theory. And this is an evolutionary theory. So it explains that humans have this automatic positive response to nature because we've evolved in nature and our brains have evolved in natural environments. So because we have this adaptive, positive feeling towards nature, which has evolved as a means for survival because we wanted to be in natural places where there's water and vegetation for shelter and food that we can get. Those instincts haven't gone away, even though we don't need to kind of seek out those things in, you know, forests and savannas anymore. But it's an evolutionary response that means our stress is automatically reduced when we're in those spaces. And studies that try and prove that theory have looked at the impact of nature doses on individual stress levels and moods, using lots of different measures like salivary cortisol, heart rate, muscle tension, skin conductance, so how much you sweat, as well as self-reports about how stressed people feel as well. And there are also quite a few studies that suggest that natural scenes are just easier for the brain to process, so they create less cognitive load, and that in turn has a knock-on effect on our stress and our attention. So I'm going to move on now to talking about differential susceptibility to the education environment, because this is quite linked to the project that I'm doing. So we know that some children might be more affected by or more sensitive to the environment than others. So particularly children with sensory needs, so perhaps children on the autistic spectrum might be much more affected by the place in which they learn. And we also know that children have different levels of baseline arousal, which makes educating 30 children in the same environment really challenging. And I can say that from experience after doing it for many years. Some children might have quite low levels of baseline arousal, they might be quite understimulated, so they need extra stimulation from the environment. So those wall displays or music playing in the classroom might not be a problem for them at all. That might actually really energize them and motivate them. But other children who've got a higher level of baseline arousal and are naturally quite overstimulated might find the same classroom completely overwhelming. And we often see that when children are first settling into school and having their first experience of that kind of environment, some of them very much shut down and will go almost into fetal position. They need to block out all of that environmental stimulation because it's too much, especially if they're not used to that kind of environment. Going back to what I said about noise in the classroom as well, research suggests that there are quite a few groups of children who are particularly affected by noisy classrooms. So children with hearing difficulties, reading deficiencies, attention deficits, children who are from noisy homes, and second language learners are all more susceptible to being negatively affected by background noise. And I think that homeschooling, due to the pandemic, was a really interesting natural experiment into this. So throughout the pandemic, when schools were closed, as part of my work for the Chartered College of Teaching, I was doing a research project with a colleague where we surveyed hundreds of teachers, almost 1,000 teachers, and then we did focus group discussions with lots as well. And we found that although there was a lot in the press about children who had really suffered as a result of the school closures, what we didn't hear about was there was a small but significant group of children who had absolutely thrived learning from home. And the teachers that we spoke to who worked with children with special educational needs and disabilities had really found this. So some of the children on the autistic spectrum, for example, had really enjoyed not having all of that extra stimulation, all of that extra social interaction. That can cause a lot of extra stress and pressure and anxiety. And without that, some of those children had really thrived. So it's something that I know a lot of teachers and schools are looking at now. How can they bring some of those benefits that children got when they were homeschooling into school? How can we make learning environments more adaptable so that children can better self-regulate and decide which environmental conditions they need to learn? So one example, I spoke to a teacher who was allowing some of her children to work outside the classroom and join the lessons by Zoom, basically with their headphones on, because it was much easier for them to focus that way than to be in a classroom with 29 other children. Also, in terms of individual differences, nature seems to be particularly beneficial for children with attention deficits, so children with ADHD, for example. And there's a bit too much there for me to go through now, but I'll focus on the final study, because this was a really interesting one where children with ADHD who were unmedicated were given activities to fatigue their attention, and then they went for a 20-minute walk in one of three settings, so either a park walk, a suburban neighbourhood with a little bit of greenery, or downtown in a very urban neighbourhood. And it was a repeated measures design, so each of the children took part in each of the walks 1 week apart. And then after each walk, they talked about what they thought about the walk, and then they had this measure of their concentration using a backwards digit span task. And performance on the task was significantly better after the park walk. And actually their improvements in the task were comparable to 2 types of ADHD medication. In addition, they said that they experienced that walk the most positively. So, you know, I feel like that's a pretty powerful result there, that there seems to be an intervention that helps children concentrate better, which is free, it has no side effects, and children enjoy it too. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that everybody should stop giving children ADHD medication and go for a walk in the park instead. We don't know what the long-term effects of that walk were, whether they just last for half an hour or whether they'd last hours later. We just don't know. So, it's not going to be able to be a replacement, but certainly might be something that can complement other treatments. So all of this also kind of takes us on to differential susceptibility theory. So this idea that some children are prone to the best or worst developmental outcomes depending on the quality of their environment when they're growing up. So this theory talks about some children just being neurobiologically sensitive. And the kind of metaphor for thinking about whether children are or aren't sensitive to the environment is to categorize them as orchids or dandelions. So orchid children, just like orchid plants, are very sensitive and very reactive. They can thrive under nurturing care, but they might have adverse outcomes in less optimal environmental conditions. So they're more susceptible to the environment. If they're in a good, positive, nurturing environment, these children will do absolutely brilliantly. If they're not, then they're really going to struggle. Unlike dandelions, dandelion children tend to be kind of hardier and able to withstand a range of environments. So they're less susceptible to environmental influences and are more likely to kind of keep on that steady, even keel, regardless of what kind of environment they're in. Now, in reality, children are much more likely to be on a continuum between those two categories rather than kind of fitting neatly into those boxes. But the metaphor is quite useful to remind us that some children might be more affected than others by the educational environment, and those who appear to struggle the most, those orchid children, might benefit the most from making the environment more optimal. So making small changes to the educational environment might have a really big impact on those orchid children. Okay, so I'm going to finish off, now I've talked about lots of existing research, I'm going to finish off the last sort of 5 to 10 minutes talking about the work that I'm doing as part of my PhD. A big part of this is about bridging the gap between research and practice. So one of my frustrations is that there's all this research out there about the importance of nature, and it just hasn't really had an impact on learning environments or school systems in the UK. And this is for quite a few reasons. There has been a huge increase in outdoor nurseries and forest schools, but it remains largely a middle class movement. There's a lack of research with children under 8 years old. As I mentioned, most of the research is correlational or kind of very detailed qualitative studies. There's far less experimental research, and often it is those kind of experimental findings that you need to change policy. It's also really difficult to isolate exactly what about nature associates most strongly with changes in behaviour or cognitive performance. So it could be that being outdoors is good because it's quieter. It could be because air quality is better. It could be to do with the landscape features or the activities that children are taking part in. It's really difficult to disentangle why it has a positive effect. And until we can do that, it's difficult to use that to our advantage as educators. And also the measures that are used across studies really vary. So all different ways of measuring behaviour, memory, attention, academic performance. And because they vary, it's really difficult to kind of compare one study to another, to build up meta-analyses and things like that. And also a lot of the measures just aren't very meaningful to teachers and parents. So, you know, the ADHD study, for example, that used a backwards digit span test, you know, there might be a lot of teachers that say, okay, well, you know, I don't really care if it improves their backwards digit span. That isn't something we do in school. I want to know, will it help them not disrupt my lesson, or will it help them do better in this maths activity? So that can affect the impact that it has on day-to-day teaching as well. So something that I've been really passionate about for a long time is bridging the gap between research and teaching practice. And some of the ways that I'm trying to do this through my project is by conducting research in schools and in multiple schools as well, so that we can see whether the effects we see hold across different settings, making sure that we recruit participants who are underrepresented in existing research, because that was often a frustration of mine as a teacher, that I would read these papers and think, okay, but the children that were in this study are nothing like the children that I'm working with here. We're working across a range of schools for extended periods of time. So we're hoping that means that our findings will be more meaningful than if we just dropped in and done something for half an hour. We're following the school's usual timetable and curriculum, with the teacher delivering the intervention. So again, you know, it's not us as researchers pulling children out one-to-one and doing something very specific. We're very much trying to fit in with what happens day to day in the school in a very naturalistic way. We're consulting with teachers, both at the schools that we work with and online through social media, about the study design and the measures that we use. And we're also working really hard to make sure that our findings are communicated with teachers throughout the research process. So the research project itself, the aims are to explore the influence of learning environments and the part they play in stress and attention, behaviour and cognition. The aim is for the measures to be robust. We're trying to make them as objective as we can and as closely related to real life learning and school outcomes as we can to maximise that relevance and to raise awareness of the importance of learning environments and how it affects individuals. So I'm working in 6 primary schools in Newham, which is East London, working in reception classes, so the children are aged 4 to 5. And in each school, we're running 8 indoor sessions and 8 outdoor sessions over a period of 4 weeks. And those sessions involve carpet sessions where the whole class is seated and the teacher is doing some instruction, either reading them a story or teaching a maths lesson. And also choosing sessions, which, you know, if you've worked in early years, that will be very familiar. Teachers have prepared tabletop activities, different resources, and the children are free flowing around, choosing which of those activities they want to do and for how long. And so during these sessions, the children are wearing little head-mounted cameras, wearable microphones, and heart rate monitors. And these are the devices. So you can see the little girl here is wearing the head-mounted camera. It's, you know, almost like a little GoPro. It's actually a teddy bear shape, but we had to turn it on its side because that brings the camera lens lower down, so it's more in line with their eye level. We really wanted that kind of child's eye view of what they're doing. She's got a little microphone clipped to the lapel there, which you might be able to see. And then she's got a little ECG sticker here, 2 more on her ribs, which is recording her heart rate. And then on the right, that's a picture of the device itself. So it's about this size and it fits into a little elasticated belt, which is worn around the chest underneath their school uniform. This is one of the schools that we were working in. So that's their indoor classroom environment. And then you'll see on the right-hand side, we've tried to replicate that environment outdoors. So we mark out the same sized area. We try and take as much of the furniture out as we can. They have the same resources outdoors as they would indoors. And this is in quite an urban school, so there's not very much nature there at all. But we're looking at the impact of them doing their carpet sessions and their choosing out there and how it differs from when they're in the indoor environment. These are just some more pictures. On the top left there is a different environment we're working in where they've got a bit more nature. So we've purposefully chosen schools that have got a varying amount of nature on site so we can see whether just being outdoors in the fresh air is enough, or actually will there be greater benefits from the schools that have got sort of forested areas and fields and so on compared to the more urban kind of concreted outdoor environments. And the measures that we're using are looking time during carpet sessions. So with the head-mounted camera footage, we can look at how much time the children spend looking at the teacher when he or she is reading a story or teaching the math session, and how much time they spend staring at displays on the walls or looking at a friend or staring out of the window. We then, after the story sessions, do a recall and comprehension task. So they sequence pictures from the story, answer some questions and retell the story in their own words. And we'll be looking at whether their recall and comprehension of the story is better, depending on whether it was read indoors or outdoors. We also use the head-mounted camera to look at the tasks that they choose during choosing time and how long they spent on each task. So did they get really engaged and involved in what they were doing and stay at a task for a long time, or did they flit around from thing to thing and do kind of 20 activities in the space of 20 minutes? And the cameras really do give us a really great view of where we can see what the children are doing with their hands and what they're interacting with. We're also coding incidents of pro and antisocial behaviour, so looking at how often they do things like share resources, incorporate a peer into their game, or how often, you know, an argument might break out, snatching or pushing or whatever. We're going to look at children's speech and language use. Do they talk more or less indoors or outdoors? And then because we have the ECG as well, we can use their heart rate as a measure of physiological stress. And we also take readings with a decibel meter frequently throughout the indoor and outdoor sessions, both when the children are seated and listening to the teacher and when they're up and about doing their choosing activities. So we can compare the noise levels indoors and outdoors, and we can see whether noise mediates any of the other effects that we might see from our other measures. So that brings me to the end of my talking time, and we'll move on to some questions. But just in summary, when we consider how we can support children's learning and behaviour, we shouldn't neglect thinking about the physical learning environment. And a really important factor is whether there's that optimum level of stimulation, not too high, not too low, but that happy medium. Different aspects of the environment, so noise, light, visual clutter, access to nature, can all affect stress and attention and levels of stimulation, which in turn can impact on children's learning and behaviour. But children might have differing susceptibility to environmental influences. We shouldn't assume that all children will respond in the same way to the same environment. And what we know about the benefits of nature access hasn't yet made a really big impact on education because of that lack of experimental research to evidence causation. It's difficult to disentangle one variable from another. What is experimental often doesn't take place in real schools or not within real circumstances, so not led by the teacher, not linked to kind of day-to-day learning activities. And there's that really wide variety of approaches and measured use, and not all of them are meaningful to teachers and policymakers. So those are all things that we're really trying to address through this project. So I'm going to finish there. I'm also just going to say thank you because I can see that my colleague Molly is on the call, who's been giving me a huge amount of support working on this project and helping to move the research forward. So I'm just going to give a quick shout out to Molly to say thank you for that as well, because just because I'm the one talking doesn't mean I'm the only one doing all the work on this. I did go through that really quickly. If you have any questions that you don't have time to ask me today, or you'd rather pop it in an email, my email address is there. I've also got an Instagram account there, which is just about outdoor learning research and learning environments. So I post lots of research summaries there of other people's research papers, but also I put lots of updates on there about this research project. And there are also some articles there I linked which go into a lot more detail about a lot of the things I've talked about today, and also explore some other variables that I didn't have time to talk about, like nature's impact on self-regulation, creativity, and things like that as well. So I'll leave those on there for a moment, and I will stop sharing, I guess, so that we can go to questions. I can see there's a couple of things in the chat as well, so I'll have a look at those and see if there's anything. Oh, Rebecca, you're muted.
So I am. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. Yes, as you said, there are a few things coming into the chat. The first one is really a comment about a school in Australia for ADHD boys, where they have 10 minutes. This sounds exhausting. They have 10-minute slots. So they have 10 minutes at their desk, then 10 minutes on a trampoline, and that goes on through the whole school day. So apart from the teacher obviously being extremely fit, I just wondered how much you knew about that and whether there's any evidence of that in the UK.
I've not heard of that. That is fascinating. I haven't heard of it. My sons would love to go to that school for sure. I haven't heard of that, but I was reading something the other day. I forget now. It was either Finland or Denmark. They were saying that all the way through primary school, the children have a 15-minute outdoor break after every 1 hour lesson, in addition to their lunch hour and playtime. And they have that all the way through to year 6. And I was thinking, goodness, compared to the amount of outdoor time children get in the UK, particularly once they're out of nursery and reception, that's kind of it. Like all the schools I've worked in, they then get 15 minutes in the morning and a lunch break, and that is all. Yeah, that's certainly not the kind of provision that we have in the UK, but I wish that we did.
Yeah. There is a question about weather from Helen. Is most of the outdoor research based on whether it's summer/good weather?
Yeah, a really good question. Most of the research that I've read is all year round. I think weather does sometimes play a part, and in some of those studies I mentioned where they look at how green the area is around the school, there's a few studies that have looked at that across different seasons, and one of them found that the impact was greater when the trees were greener and there was more canopy. compared to in the autumn. So that was quite a kind of convincing finding. For our project, we make a note of the weather and the temperature every day. We are doing it year round. So we started off working in schools back in sort of February, where it was really quite chilly. Kids had their kind of coats and hats on. We were having to put tarpaulin down on the floor because it was kind of cold for them to sit down. And we'll be running it right the way through.
My
friend.
Oh,
we have somebody whose mic is on, but I think it's gone now.
I think they're gone now. So yeah, we are making a note of it, and it's something that we will kind of run through our analyses to see whether the temperature and the weather has an impact or not.
Great. I am just going to present one more question, and then I've already told Gemma that unfortunately I have to go at 5:02, but Michael Thomas has kindly said that he will take over the questions. So my last introduction of a question is from Marcello, who says, what do you think about the online learning environments? Which modifications should be made to these environments? I know nothing about this.
No, I can't say I'm an expert in online learning environments either. What we did find when we did that project I mentioned, where we interviewed lots of teachers, and we asked them about ways that they'd supported their students' well-being during school closures. A really popular thing was, they said, you know, encouraging their children to get outside as much as possible during the day was really important. And I know that there are findings coming through now about the amount of time children spent sat still at screens during that period was quite detrimental to their well-being. So I do think even if learning online, it's still important to kind of get out and about outside as well. And something I noticed with my own son when he was learning online was, without that physical stimulation of being in the classroom with his peers, he was having to try and replicate a lot of that stimulation himself. So when I would go into his room and he was in his online lessons, he's got these LED strip lights around his room, which he had on, flashing. He would have music in the background, and I'd say, this is awful, like, why are you doing this? You can't possibly concentrate when you're doing this. But what I actually realized afterwards, when I was just incidentally reading some research about kind of levels of arousal and stimulation, is that actually he was subconsciously just increasing his own level of stimulation to try and keep engaged in what he was doing, because he just didn't have that stimulation from a classroom environment the way he would in school.
Excellent. So handing over to me, I just want to say, Gemma, it was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. So on to the next question from Irene. Did you find strong evidence for gender differences in the various impacts of, the question just moved, gender differences in the various impacts of the physical environment on school children's learning?
I can't say yet for our research. We're still in the very early stages. We're only in the kind of second school of 6 that we're going to work in. And so we haven't analysed that yet. In terms of the other research I've read, I haven't read anything about gender differences in terms of the classroom environment. I have read about gender differences in terms of how green the area is. So there was one study, I can't remember which one now, I'm afraid. There was one study which found that residential greenness had a bigger impact on girls than it did on boys. And one of the reasons that the kind of researchers put forward for that is maybe boys spend more time further from the home environment than girls do. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that, you know, that was one of the reasons that they put forward.
Great, thanks. Abby asks, how do you find the children cope with the wearable tech? Do all children wear it during each session, or just a few children at a time?
So this is something we're struggling with a little bit at the moment, to be honest. So it's not every child in the class that takes part. Their parents have to give consent, and we also get the child's consent as well. If they don't want to wear it, we don't make them wear it. They're generally quite good. They tend to forget about the head-mounted cameras quite easily. They're a little bit more cautious about the ECG because it has the stickers that go on, and I think they worry that it's going to be like a plaster and it's going to be sore taking it off. But we do a lot of familiarization with the children before we put it on. So I go into the schools, I stick the ECG stickers on my face and peel them off to show that it doesn't hurt. We put the equipment on a teddy bear. We let them play with the teddy bear with the equipment on. And we go in for quite a few sessions so they get to know us as well, because otherwise it can be quite daunting for a child if as a stranger we go in and say, okay, lift up your school uniform, we're going to stick these stickers on you. It could be a bit alarming. So we do everything we can to make the children feel comfortable. They do sometimes say, no, I don't want to wear it today. And then we kind of gently say, are you sure? But if they say no, then we accept that. And they do sometimes come up to us during the session and say, oh, can we take it off now? And we'll say, how about 10 more minutes? And then normally they keep it on, but they only actually have it on for an hour anyway. So it's not too long, but yeah, it depends very much on the child, often how sensitive they are, whether they kind of feel a bit itchy and uncomfortable with that band around them. Some of them just put it on and are completely comfortable.
Great. I'm gonna sneak in a question of my own, if that's okay, and then we have a question from Brittany after that. So I'm just wondering about the differential susceptibility idea in educational environments, and I know it's kind of early days for that and still trying to build an evidence base, but could you ever imagine being able to predict what educational environment will be best for an individual child, and what kind of data, what kind of screening test, or what you would possibly do to be able to predict for each child what environment would best suit them?
I think it probably would be possible to predict if you kind of collect, if you did lots of questionnaires and, maybe kind of did the kind of research that we're doing in lots of different environments. But I don't think we need to predict what's right for every child. I think we have to have flexible environments that allow the child to make their own choices. And I think that's part of the education as well, getting children to kind of tune into how they're feeling, recognize when they're feeling overstimulated or when they're feeling a bit lazy. And we see work like that out there as well. If you're familiar with zones of regulation and things like that, that's very much moving towards that kind of child's own awareness. And then if we provide options within our learning environment so that children can put ear defenders on if it's getting a bit too noisy, or they can retreat into a little fabric wigwam, or they can go over and do something very sensory if they want to kind of increase their stimulation. I think it's about, adapting environments so there are those kind of choices. I think it's great that often children in nursery and reception can choose to do their learning outdoors. I think it's a travesty that when they get older, they can't. I know for sure that my children would enjoy going to school much more if they were allowed to take their maths book outside and do it out there. And why not? Why don't we let them do that? I just don't know. But I hope that that flexibility will come in future so that children can be where they feel, most comfortable, because that's when they'll learn best.
Great, thanks. A question then from Brittany. Such amazing research, and I greatly look forward to tracking what you find. I study the impact of noise on development, and I was just wondering what your prediction is regarding the impact of noise in your study. Do you expect that perhaps students in schools within noisier locations will reap less of the benefits from being outdoors and in nature? Presumably, there would then be more sensory stimulation and unpredictable noise that might negatively impact them. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, really interesting question. We're hoping we might be able to, from the microphone footage, get some kind of measures of how unpredictable and complex the soundscape is indoors and outdoors, so that we can look at that as a mediator. My prediction is that students in noisier indoor classrooms will benefit more from being outdoors, because there's some kind of research there to suggest that it's children that are from noisier environments and more urban environments that kind of need that nature contact more and seek to kind of reap the most from that. In terms of more sensory stimulation outdoors, I guess it's tricky. If you're next to a really noisy road, possibly. But I think in terms of the sensory stimulation, because of that kind of attention restoration theory, where it talks about that kind of softly fascinating stimuli, I think there is a lot of sensory stimulation outdoors in nature, but I think it's much gentler than a lot of indoor kind of sensory stimulation, which is a lot more kind of in your face, lots of different shapes, sharp corners, many different colours. I think that creates a lot more load for children than that kind of natural sensory stimulation.
Great. On to Grace, who asks, is there any evidence that being surrounded by nature during childhood, i.e. having an outdoor classroom each year, results in better mental health in adulthood?
Yeah, there's lots. So I don't know about in terms of an outdoor classroom. I don't know if there's any longitudinal studies that have tracked kind of outdoor learning all the way through into outcomes for adulthood, but there's plenty of evidence that shows that growing up in greener areas, and particularly, more natural spaces, there are better mental health outcomes. And a lot of that research is based around urban environments. If you grow up in an urban environment, you're at much higher risk for lots and lots of poor mental health outcomes. I think depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, quite a lot.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting neuroscience coming out on that, on like a kind of social stress network and amygdala and anterior cingulate, and finding different effects depending on where you grew up and how urban that was and where you currently are.
Exactly, yeah. So they think that people who grow up in urban environments don't just experience more stress, but we process stressful things differently, and more sort of hypersensitive almost to stress.
Great. We have a few comments here from Jessica Massione. She says, "Thank you, Gemma, for this fantastic presentation. I study individual differences in children's reactions to noise in the classroom, and in particular how it relates to their attentional skills. When working at the school level, it can sometimes be difficult to disentangle the impact of SES because there are SES factors at the school level, location of the school, deprivation in the area, noise around the school, and at the individual level, family environment. Depending on study design, we can either control for them or do group comparisons. Do you have any measure of SES in your study, and what predictions would you have with regards to how children benefit from outdoor environments? Would you expect children who are exposed from more noise in the home to benefit more, but would not the children be more exposed to noise from outdoor in the school?" Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. A lot in there. A lot in there.
That's a really meaty question. Okay, let me try and go through bit by bit. So I agree, it's a huge problem to disentangle SES. We do have a measure of SES in our study. It's very basic. I can't say that it's perfect. So we're looking at children who are entitled to free school meals. I forget now the name of it. It's not just whether they are entitled to free school meals now, but it's over a period of years. I can't remember if it's 4 or 6 years. That's the measure that we're using. We can also look at the proportion of children who are entitled to free school meals in the whole school to kind of get a measure of area deprivation. But even that isn't perfect, because having worked in Newham myself, I know that often some of our most deprived families are not registered for free school meals because they have no recourse to public funds, and often those are your most vulnerable families, and they're not reflected in the data. Also in Newham, everybody gets free school meals, so there's no incentive to fill out the paperwork. So there's lots and lots of issues. My prediction in terms of SES is loosely that children with lower SES would benefit more from nature. That is only under the assumption that children who are from lower SES families already have lower nature contact. That's certainly not true in all cases, but there is some research to suggest that children from lower SES families are less likely to visit nature with their families. And so I would expect children who don't have that outdoor access outside of school to benefit the most from it when it happens inside school. Would you expect children who are exposed from more noise in the home to benefit more? Yes, because research shows that children that are from noisier homes are worse affected by noisy classrooms. So I would expect that outdoor learning to help counterbalance some of that. And then that last point, but wouldn't the children be exposed to more noise? Would children be exposed to noise from outdoors in the school? I'm not sure, but I'm not sure what you mean by that bit.
Sorry, Gemma.
Hi.
I put too much. I just realized how overwhelming it is to put a long question in the chat. Excuse me. That was related to Brittany's question about the fact that it's outdoor. And so we're thinking if the school is exposed to car noise from traffic or from airplanes, if actually then they will hear it more. But you already answered to that because so I think
we will be battling against a bit of traffic noise outdoors, but I think that will be less disruptive than the very noisy indoor sort of chatter and chair scraping and all of that, where it's kind of bouncing off every surface. I think it will be less detrimental than that, but we'll see. Time will tell.
Okay. Yeah, well, we're past 5 now, so we'll almost wrap up. But again, I'm going to abuse my position and sneak in one more question. So this is a bit of a research designy question. So I'm just interested in there's a whole lot of novelty about going outdoors to do a lesson, particularly if you've like transposed your indoor classroom outdoors. And I can imagine that there is this Hawthorne effect of interventions of like novelty. We're an intervention. This is new and exciting and interesting. So if you were to have an active control condition to find out that it was really outdoors or it was really nature doing the work for you and not novelty, something different, or being an intervention and so forth, what would your active control condition be?
Interesting. It's hard because whatever you're going to introduce is going to be novelty. So I think, you know, you could kind of do indoor plants, or you could do, you know, slideshows of nature, but that's still going to be novelty for the children. I mean, one of the things we do to control for that is we do have a piloting phase in each school, and we do take them outdoors and take the classroom outdoors, which doesn't count as one of the data collection days. Partly because we need to get the children used to being outside, and also the rules to do with being outside, because we have to get them to understand that although we're outside, this is still your classroom. So actually you can't run over there to the climbing frame, because we're trying to keep everything as consistent between indoors and outdoors as we can, which is quite hard for them, especially if they're used to being able to use the outdoor environment in a very different way and run and jump and chase. And we're saying, well, no, you wouldn't do that in your indoor classroom, so you can't do it here. So that piloting phase helps with that. Is also why we're doing 4 weeks in each school and 8 sessions, and we will kind of look at, we're interested in how it changes over time as well. So is there that novelty effect and then it changes, or is there a cumulative effect where the more time they spend outside, the more they get used to it and benefit from it and relax into it? You know, those kind of patterns we're interested to look into. But the control condition, I don't know. Have you got an idea? What would you do?
Well, a little bit is constraints in the school and the amount of space, but I guess an active control is you would want to give them the chance to have some lessons in a different special indoor classroom. You know, maybe go into the year 6's classroom, because you know that's a special different classroom, and have some lessons in there, because that maintains indoors, but would have a kind of novelty factor for them.
Yeah.
As you know, that's not really practical because the year 6's are in that classroom.
Yeah.
Schools don't have a spare classroom to give you an active control condition. So. Okay, I think we should wrap it up. So just wanted to say thanks again to Gemma for a fantastic presentation. Really interested to see how that experiment works out. And maybe you'll come back and talk to us about when you've got some results.
Yeah, I would love to, for sure.
Super. Thanks very much, everyone. I will turn off recording.
Thanks very much. Bye.